Career ambassador. He was an ambassador in Iraq, in Yemen, and Kuwait. And he has 40 years of service in the United States Foreign Service. He is a graduate of Brigham Young University, along with all 9 of his siblings. Is that true? Am I saying this correctly? His family he also grew up in a family in the Foreign Service. So we're very happy to have him come today and share his experiences with us. And so I'll turn the time over to him.
Good, thank you, Ryan. Get this microphone off and make sure everybody can hear me. Well, it's an interesting group, combining, and I'll try to speak to both some of the career issues, careers in national security, international affairs, with a particular focus on U.S. government. Are there any non-U.S. citizens that are part of this group? Okay. My own experience, obviously, with the U.S. government and U.S. positions, and then also civic engagement. That's so that's a course or a club or a.
I think it's both things. I think it's a minor.
Good. Okay. Good. Well, as Ryan said, I attended BYU 1975 to 1981. Served a 2-year mission in Spain during that period. I graduated and went to graduate school, and after graduate school entered the Foreign Service, which had always been my plan. As said, I'd seen my father in that service, and it appealed to me for a number of reasons, and I can talk about some of those reasons. The U.S. government, through the Foreign Service, it changes from time to time, but it also always primarily has been a system of competitive series of screening process through written and then oral examinations, and then basically, depending on experience added in, language and other skills, offering positions in the Foreign Service. There are Foreign Service positions not only with the Department of State, but with the U.S. Agency for International Development, with the Department of Commerce, with the Department of Agriculture, and then the Foreign Broadcasting Board, which oversees the VOA and other U.S. government public affairs, public diplomacy entities that support TV and radio stations abroad. But the State Department is the primary pillar of U.S. Foreign Service positions. There are commercial attachés from the Department of Commerce that serve at embassies, foreign agricultural attachés. But a typical embassy, U.S. embassy, will probably only have about 25% of the American direct hire employees who are actually from the Department of State. The Department of State manages these embassies as platforms for all elements of the U.S. government to be in a particular country, and in most cases the country, although we have multilateral missions as well. So who are all the other people who are at an embassy beyond State Department Foreign Service officers? Well, the law enforcement agencies, in particular over the last 20 years, law enforcement has grown significantly as a component of U.S. projection of its presence overseas. Counterterrorism, narcotics, global crime, criminal activities. And so the FBI, but the FBI is not the only law enforcement agency, and in fact the State Department through the Diplomatic Security Agency has a law enforcement presence abroad. But the Department of Justice, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Army, CID, all of the various military law enforcement agencies, the drug enforcement agencies. So probably beyond the State Department, the largest component often will be military or law enforcement agencies. Of course, we have intelligence presence overseas. Those are maintained as platforms for relationships and engagement with a host country's intelligence and security services. All of this happens under the umbrella of a chief of mission who is the president's selected representative and oversees all executive branch work abroad, in an embassy abroad. Well, why do we have embassies? We get that question, and sometimes people wonder whether we really need some of these large presence abroad, because it's very, very expensive for the U.S. government to send people abroad, to have them in a secure facility, to be supporting them and their families in an overseas environment. Well, we do it largely because the United States uniquely has interests globally, and we are probably the only country currently that has pretty much universal diplomatic representation, with only maybe 4 or 5 countries where we do not have a diplomatic presence. Otherwise, we try to maintain presence everywhere. We advance U.S. business and commercial interests. We protect the welfare of American citizens. We advance economic cooperation, political cooperation. Military and law enforcement agencies will work with their counterparts in a host government agency in order to try to streamline cooperation. But largely what the work of diplomacy is about, it's premised on the assumption that we are generally stronger if we act in concert with others rather than acting alone. And there might be times where we will choose to act alone, and the United States has the capability to do that. But usually administrations from both Republican and Democratic parties have always sought to try to establish relations with foreign governments and international organizations in a way to leverage U.S. influence in ways that makes us more influential, more able to advance and defend U.S. interest abroad. I'm going to speak for a moment about the career aspects of this, because people often wonder, well, what's a good preparation for foreign service? The State Department recruits foreign service officers. One, they want to have people who are representative and reflect the diversity and broad U.S. government. That's always an ongoing effort. My father entered the Foreign Service in 1957 at a time when the Secretary of State at that time wanted to try to wean the Foreign Service away from its reliance largely on East Coast Ivy League institutions, almost exclusively male. And they sought to reach out to other parts of the United States. He was just graduating from Utah State University. His history professor was contacted by a recruiter from the Department of State, and so my father entered when there was an effort to try to expand the diversity of the Foreign Service. But the premise is always that when embassies are, while they can be quite large in terms of the number of personnel, you never have enough people, because you are basically operating with a very, very thin stream of people representing the U.S. government abroad. So you need people who are versatile, who are flexible, who can quickly adjust to whatever an issue might arise and be quick experts on it. So Foreign Service officers, the recruitment process seeks to, through the oral exam and the written exam, look for people who are well-read. I sometimes ask if there's ways to prepare for the Foreign Service exam. Anybody here taken the Foreign Service written exam? In some ways, it's a little bit like some of the other standardized tests, graduate record exam or others, but it particularly has it covers history, English, literature, arts, economics, political science, a broad array of topics, because they want people that have a broad array of interest and can speak with some knowledge on a broad array of issues. So one of the tips that I often give people is get a subscription to The Economist and read it cover to cover for a year, every edition of it. Now, the truth is if you're the type of person that can do that or is interested in doing that, you're probably pretty well suited to the Foreign Service. But in fact, for the general knowledge and background part of it, the Foreign Service looks for people who have an expansive range of interests. They do recruit some people who are specialists in particular areas, but the Foreign Service generalist, which is the diplomatic corps, is divided into 5 different functional specialties. There are political officers, economic officers, pretty much speaks exactly what they do in terms of working on the political or economic aspects of a bilateral relationship. Management officers who manage that platform that all the U.S. executive branch agencies operate from. Consular officers who the State Department oversees the system for overseeing and authorizing travel, legitimate travel to the United States through visas, and then also consular work for American citizens, welfare, whereabouts of American citizens. If you're overseas and you get arrested, somebody in the U.S. Embassy is going to be your best friend really quickly. You'll be very, very happy to see a vice consul or somebody show up at the prison and start to help you. We can't get you out of jail, but we can advise you on getting local legal representation, and then we try to assure that you're not being treated any differently because you're an American, but that you get treated the way everybody else is. That may not be particularly reassuring if you're in a prison in Turkey or Thailand or somewhere where it's not particularly pleasant, but that is part of the consular function. Then there's public affairs, and public affairs oversees public diplomacy. Cultural exchange, they are the embassy spokespersons, they deal with the media. We try to have academic, media and other exchanges, and we fund those through public affairs officers. So those are the 5 main areas. Now, that said, particularly during the course of my career, the expansion and growth in the U.S. national security agencies has really been quite astonishing. I think the estimates are that there are now more than 3 million people who have national security clearances to work in the various agencies. Some of those work as contractors, but the majority work directly for the U.S. government in all the broad array of U.S. agencies that, particularly since 9/11, have sought to work overseas and have worked with the State Department in order to put their own presence at embassies overseas. So there really is a wide array of career opportunities. Most Foreign Service officers, and I include myself in this, find the career attractive. One, because you enjoy the challenge, the stimulus that you get from living in a foreign environment and everything that goes along with that. But also there's a strong streak of idealism. And everybody that I know in the Foreign Service to some extent is in the Foreign Service because they believe that they're doing something worthwhile, representing their government abroad, advancing U.S. government issues. That's a great privilege to be able to represent the U.S. government when you're abroad. The truth is, and particularly in some of the countries where I served, our bilateral relationship is not very good. While I was in Yemen, we had a number of attacks on the embassy. There was a coup that overthrew the government. A Houthi Iranian-sponsored militia group took control of Sana'a, remained there for about another 6 months after that, dealing with a government that really, in many ways, my picture was spread around town with a big red cross through it as they wanted to expel me as the Great Satan. And we hung on. When we left Yemen, of course, finally ultimately deciding that we weren't able to be effective from within Yemen, and we moved our embassy to Saudi Arabia, where we worked with a government in exile. But we were not popular. Most Yemeni people really didn't want us there. They were influenced by the Houthi revolutionary movement and wanted to expel the United States. In Iraq, of course, we had regular attacks from Iranian-sponsored militia groups, rocket attacks, drone attacks on our embassy and our facilities against our personnel as we moved around the country in various places. And so security was a very, very important component, because part of the President's instructions to the President's representative as Chief of Mission at an embassy abroad is the ambassador, the Chief of Mission, is personally accountable for the safety and security of all American embassy employees, whether American citizens or the large component of local nationals or third country nationals that we have employed. So that's a big responsibility, and security took up quite a bit of my mental and emotional energy serving both in Yemen and Iraq, where our ability to travel and move around was always constrained because of the security threat. The other agencies, of course, the intelligence agencies and all of the components that, and this goes far beyond the CIA. There are 12 different agencies that make up the intelligence community within the State Department. The Bureau of Internal INR is the wing of the State Department that's part of the intelligence agency, but DIA, NSA, National Reconnaissance. So there's this large intelligence community, and probably more people employed within the broad intelligence community than any other part of the national security, civilian national security agencies. The Department of Defense, in addition to the uniformed service, has a large number of civilian components. They recruit, and the intelligence agencies have a separate recruitment process, but ultimately are similar to the civil service, and the defense intelligence and other agencies also recruit through the civil service. Civil service positions are open through competitive examination, application, you apply, and then you can advance in a career within the civil service, unlike within the foreign service, by applying for different positions. If you are selected and assigned to a position, then you can get promoted up to the level of that position. The unique feature of the Foreign Service, and this was, we're just coming up on the 100th anniversary of the modern Foreign Service created by the Rogers Act in 1924, established a system where there would be this competitive examination, but also people would have rank in person. So you have a rank in yourself, not depending on the position that you occupy. And promotions are granted through a competitive peer review process. Your promotion panels meet and peers review and select top 5% of people in any cohort or any class and advance them. So the reason for that, again, is because the recognition that in some cases you have an embassy that may only have 5 or 6 foreign service officers, and they have to be prepared to operate well beyond perhaps their level of experience or training would give them. Today, the Foreign Service is looking increasingly at investing more in training. So if any of you are looking at the Foreign Service's careers, you probably will, through the course of your career, spend more time in training than I did over the course of my career. There is language training, of course. We are unique amongst diplomatic services in the United States, is there's no requirement for language to enter the Foreign Service. In order to gain tenure, which you can get within the first 3 to 5 years of service, you have to demonstrate competency in at least one language. But you do not need to have a foreign language in order to enter the Foreign Service. I'm going to stop there in terms of the career part of it, and if there are questions related to that or to the civic engagement, I'd appreciate if, as you ask a question, just give a brief introduction so I know who you are and what your particular interest is. Yes?
My name is Rosalind Neville. I'm a political science and Mandarin major here at BYU. And my question is, when you see a switch in presidents, does the Foreign Service's approach to diplomacy change or have significant differences differing president to president?
It does change a certain bit, and of course there's a process that we've always followed in change of administrations where the civil service, foreign service, after an election begin to prepare immediately. The incoming administration will have a landing party that will arrive at the agency in the State Department. You begin to work with those people. You may be assigned as a Foreign Service officer to work with the incoming administration. You're preparing briefing papers and because we want to have as seamless a process of transition as possible. We have in our system of government, senior positions are filled by presidential appointment. And so there's always quite a bit of turnover of personnel in key positions. So secretaries of cabinet departments, deputy secretaries, to a certain extent down to the third or fourth level, often will be political appointees. Some administrations have chosen to have more political appointees and to embed them further down in the bureaucracy. Others have not followed that path. I was, of course, I served under President Obama, under President Trump, and then President Biden. And so I saw those transitions quite directly because in my position I received new letters of instruction as the new administration came in, with the exception of the Trump administration, which came in and I only received a draft of letter of instructions. They never got the National Security Council to actually, they couldn't agree on text for a letter of instructions. And then of course I had a rather unique optic on the period in the latter part of 2020, November, December, and into January, where there really was some question and there was a lot of turmoil at the senior levels of the Trump administration in terms of the transition. And when the Biden administration came in, they had not had the opportunity because the State Department and other federal agencies were ordered not to cooperate with the transition teams of the incoming administration. So they did not get office space, they didn't get computers, they didn't get security clearances and do that. So that was unique, and of course also where I was at the time and with the ongoing issues with Iran and the prospect that possibly there would be an escalation of U.S.-Iranian tensions as a way to affect whether President Trump would leave office or not. So I was in daily contact with the Secretary of Defense and the Central Command Agency in terms of some of the things that were going on. We scaled down our presence in Baghdad by about 70% as we did that. But if you step back and look at the larger, there really aren't too many differences between the Democratic Party platforms on national security and Republican Party platforms. All of our political parties want a strong United States. That said, there are differences in emphasis. Let me give one example. The Trump administration, and part of this is a stream within the Republican Party, that has always been skeptical of multilateral international organizations and unwilling to constrain U.S. freedom of action by working with institutions, whether it be the UN, the EU, and others. The Democratic Party traditionally has been more willing to look at ways, perhaps giving up some of our sovereignty or freedom of action as a sovereign nation, as a trade-off for some of the gains that we have by cooperating with the UN or other international organizations. NATO is a big question, and of course I think it will be one of the major foreign policy issues that will be discussed at least behind closed doors in this next 6 months as we go into November election, because President Trump has repeatedly expressed skepticism about NATO, particularly the feeling that, and it's not an unfounded feeling, that often the U.S. Carries more than its share of the burden of the international order that has allowed many countries to prosper. NATO is one example of that, of course, and we've asked all NATO members to try to achieve certain targets on security spending. And President Trump famously has, publicly called into question those countries that are not, and called into question the value of NATO. So I think there's a fairly stark difference on that. On the other hand, John Bolton, who I know quite well, I saw him on the news yesterday, and he was saying he didn't think that there was too much danger of President Trump making good on the threat to withdraw from NATO. He'll be distracted by something else and move on too. So I don't think I got myself in any trouble with saying any of that. So that's, yes.
So I know.
You want to tell me?
My name's Josh. I'm a political science student as well,
Mm-hmm.
from Virginia, and I I assume there's different levels of like bureaucracy or complexity in embassies that we like, I don't know, Mexico or somewhere where we're very established versus an embassy where we're not as established or haven't been very long. What do the duties or the different responsibilities look like for a diplomat that say is in charge of an embassy like in Mexico or Germany or somewhere where we're well established versus a diplomat in like a developing country that we have a new embassy or they have more of those responsibilities? What do the differences look like between, you know, if I'm the top diplomat here versus the top? Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, of course, the embassy and the nature of the work and the relationship is, well, it's all driven by what is the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and the host country. In the case of kind of some of the countries you mentioned, Mexico, Germany, we have very, very complex, multi-layered relationships. I served 4 years in London, very, very large embassy in a large European country, and probably our most important bilateral relationship. But oddly enough, the nature of the U.S.-UK relationship is such that so much of it really doesn't depend on an embassy's work, because there are tremendous bilateral relationships that exist on a non-official level. We don't need, as an embassy, to be trying to encourage investment of the UK and the US and vice versa, or academic exchanges. That happens naturally because there are so many things that happen. I would talk to Brits who refused to believe that Ford was actually a US company. I tell them, no, Ford was a U.S. company. They say, no, my dad worked for Ford, my grandfather worked for Ford, the big Ford plants that produced. So that's a complex relationship, but the embassy focuses on a much narrower range of issues. You'd be surprised at how large some of our larger embassies are. In Cairo, where I served as the deputy chief of mission, the deputy ambassador, and the person who really is sort of responsible for the day-to-day running and management of that platform, we had about 12,000 employees. Most of those employees were Egyptian nationals. We couldn't have managed the embassy without the Egyptian nationals who did everything from our motor pool vehicles, transportation, maintenance of our facilities and buildings. But then, of course, some of the Egyptian employees, as often happens in embassies, bring an awful lot of skills. Your long-term economic specialist or commercial specialist who really know a lot of the companies and know contacts, can do due diligence and research. You have an American officer that might supervise it, but you'll have local nationals that will bring a lot of that expertise. In Iraq, we had about 4,000 employees at the embassy in Iraq and about 1,200 at our consulate general in Erbil. It was a very complex relationship because we had, of course, this relationship with Iraq that emerged out of the decision of then President Bush to overthrow the Saddam Hussein regime and foster a new constitution and a new government. It hasn't gone particularly well. The old rule that Secretary Powell used to say, you break it, you buy it. We had responsibilities for a lot of things in Iraq. For example, the Central Bank of Iraq still has all of its foreign reserves that are deposited in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, going back to the time of Saddam Hussein. And so all of Iraq's foreign earnings go into the Federal Reserve of New York. And they don't have a system for electronic transfers, so we had to transfer physical cash and US dollars that were then held by auction under the supervision of the US Federal Reserve. So there are really very, very complex issues that are going on in that bilateral relationship. Manila, Philippines, very, very large embassy, probably about 8,000 or 9,000 employees between Americans and local nationals. So you are, if you're the ambassador, you are trying to sort of focus on the larger strategic picture of what are the U.S. strategic objectives. You have a country team and a deputy chief of mission that sort of try to keep everything in harmony and working towards that. But it can be challenging. Sometimes agencies have their own sense of what the priorities can be. The ambassador ultimately has authority over all agencies abroad, but if that isn't exercised wisely and skillfully, some senior FBI agent says, I don't need to listen to this State Department guy who doesn't know what my job is, but you need to try to demonstrate to all of the agencies that the expertise you bring because of your knowledge of the country and the host government and how to accomplish objectives, they'll get more done if they work with you and under your supervision.
So follow-up question with that.
Okay.
You said that a lot of, so obviously the top of the embassy's administrative, or the tops are appointed by the executive branch, and sometimes they go down deeper into the bureaucracy. But are most of the deputy directors or directors of missions, are those mostly?
At most embassies, we have about 30% of our embassies are headed by ambassadors who are political appointees, who are appointed by a president from outside the ranks of the Foreign Service or the federal service. And of course, that may be personal friends, associates, supporters, campaign donors, and others. And so typically, the large, attractive European posts often will be filled by people who have made. Our last ambassador in the UK, Andy Johnson, the owner of the New York Jets, so he was the ambassador in the UK, and that's not atypical. But below the level of the ambassador, generally, both the State Department personnel who occupy the senior positions that make up the country team and the heads of the different executive branch agencies, there may be a defense attaché or an office of military cooperation. There'll be a station chief from the intelligence that oversees all the intelligence operations. The country team meets and sort of is the way you coordinate all of those efforts. Management and personal skills and people skills is very important by the time you rise to the senior levels, because you're juggling an awful lot of competing agencies and agendas. See, we got a question here.
My name's Olivia. I'm a Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic major.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess a couple questions. You've kind of talked about how most of your stations seem to have been in the MENA region, and so I was wondering,
Mm-hmm.
do you speak Arabic? Do you have a specific skill set? Is that typical to stay in one region? Did you graduate just in poli-sci? What was your graduate degree?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Within the Foreign Service, and particularly political and economic officers, often will tend to have area expertise. And the State Department wants to have a body of people who have acquired real area expertise, know the regions and the countries. And so I have colleagues who have spent most of their career in Far East, China hands or Japan hands, the Soviet Union and former Soviet Union countries, and Russia, Europe, Africa. Middle East is a particularly interesting geographic region. It's relatively small in terms of the geographic bureaus. I had always wanted to serve in as an Arabist. I learned Arabic when I was young, living in Morocco. And then while I was at BYU, and any of you taking Arabic, you can thank me for having Arabic programs at BYU. When I came back off my mission, I wanted to take Arabic. I convinced the linguistics department that if I could get 6 people to sign up for an intro classical Arabic class, they would find a teacher. They found a teacher 6 weeks into the course, just right after the ad drop date. He dropped dead. And so we didn't have a teacher, so we kind of did self-instruction for a while, working at it. And a friend, Dill Parkinson, who, Dill I know now is retired, but Dill was just graduating with a PhD in Arabic language studies from the University of Michigan, agreed to come back, and the linguistics department said they'd give him office space, a certain amount of time to finish his dissertation if he would teach a class. Dill is absolutely a brilliant language instructor, and he really formed the foundation, and all I think of the current instructors began to take Arabic under Dill. Dill convinced me that I was advanced enough that I could take the exam to qualify for a fellowship at the Center for Arabic Study Abroad. So I deferred my graduate studies at Harvard. When I graduated, went to Cairo for a year to do advanced Arabic study, then completed my master's degree at Harvard, and then entered the Department of State, already with Arabic and with the intent to serve in the Middle East. All of my assignments, including the one that I mentioned in London, were really NEA assignments. I was in London 4 years working with the Iraqi opposition groups and the various exile groups in London. So Arabic was an important part of it. Language helps, but there's a lot more. Language is just kind of the ticket for entry. Yes?
My name's Caleb Dewey. I'm also a Middle Arabic major. I'm curious, over the time that you've been with the Foreign Service and various presidencies that you've had, what kind of long-term policy goals or ideas the U.S. has for its relationships in the Middle East? Like, is it still trying to be actively involved in the same way as it was 10, 15 years ago, or has that changed?
70 years ago. Let's see, how much time have we got here? This is part of the reason I was interested in the Middle East, of course, having lived in North Africa, Maghreb countries when I was young. There's a sense that the challenges that the U.S. faces in a region like the Middle East, where in the post-colonial era, the governments have not been able to establish a basis for legitimacy. And in a way, you have a collection from Morocco across to Iran of countries that are struggling to establish themselves as successful nation states. To a certain degree, they fall on a spectrum of failed states. They don't have governments that have been able to demonstrate to their populace that their legitimacy as a government derives out of the services that they provide to the population as a whole. For a large period of time after the World War II and the post-colonial era, many of those governments first turned to the ideology of pan-Arabism or various leftist secular ideologies as a way to try to demonstrate legitimacy to the people. That failed, particularly after Nasser, who sort of led that era, losing the 1967 war and then dying in 1970. Began a process that we are still living with today of almost all of the governments in the Middle East to some extent seek to establish their legitimacy by claiming to have religious credentials, that they are trying to rule in an Islamic fashion. And of course, the problem with mixing religion and politics is you don't leave room for the give and take of compromise. And somebody will always pop up who's more extreme and will accuse whatever individual propagating some form of religious philosophy as the basis for governance, say, well, you're a sellout. And that, of course, is what we see today, where we have countries like Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, to a certain extent Iraq, and others that really are failed states. The governments do not do what we expect governments to do. They do not have a monopoly on the use of force. There are militias and warlords and other groups within the country that operate as states within those states. So I always thought it was interesting for the U.S. government because for a variety of reasons, the relationship with Israel and our commitment to the security of Israel, which has set us at odds for 70 years with the Arab states, but of course the emergence of the Gulf Arab states as economic powers, and then of course the repeated conflicts in the Middle East that time and time again have dragged the U.S. into conflict in the region, the number of times. And if you look over the last 70 years, and about every 5 to 10 years, we find ourselves once again being dragged into the Middle East. And I saw repeatedly administrations that I worked for coming in and saying, we want to pivot to China, we want to pivot to the Pacific, we want to get away, we just are tired of always being dragged into the Middle East. The Middle East has this capability for its hand to kind of reach up out of the grave, grab you by the throat, and drag you back in. And we all understand some of the reasons for that. And we've seen, of course, the divisive nature and how polarizing the conflict in Gaza since the attacks in Israel on October 7th and what that's done to our domestic politics. And of course, Israel's response to that and the debate within even our presidential campaign about that is going to have some impact in swing states. So my own feeling is we're not going to get away from it. It's going to continue to, and for all the talk about us wanting to just leave that dirty little backyard of the world and turn our attention to other things, that's not going to happen because the Middle East is going to continue to drag us back in. Particularly now and since 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and a combination of other events that all happened within that year. We have Iran as a country that is seeking to supplant the U.S. as the guarantor of security in the region. Iran wants to see the U.S. out of the region. And of course, Iran has common cause with Russia and China that resent what they see as a Pax Americana, that sort of the U.S. has made the rules of the international order and gets to benefit from that. And so Russia, China, Iran, and they try to find other countries that have sympathies with the idea that somehow the U.S. system has primarily benefited the U.S. and the Western European countries, and they want to see that order upset. Okay, I did that relatively quickly, but that's part of the reason I've always been attracted to the Middle East and like to do it. And most people who serve in that region kind of have an addiction to crisis, and we're adrenaline junkies. We got any questions on this side? Well, I salute all of you, particularly for those of you who are interested in government service. It's not a way to get rich, but it is a way to have a very, very fulfilling, challenging career. A note of caution, I, of course, grew up as a Foreign Service dependent. My father served primarily overseas. And then during my career, we raised 5 children overseas. And particularly for our 2 youngest sons, who are now 30 and 32, they had very different schooling and growing up experiences than their older siblings. Because after 9/11, the security aspects of our presence abroad became sort of trumping everything else. And we had to take into account the attacks that various elements were going to continue to try to conduct against the U.S. government. Family was evacuated from posts twice in Riyadh, once in Kuwait, once in Cairo. So our youngest son, rather than sort of progressing through school at different schools, was evacuated twice during his 4th grade year, came back here to Provo where we have a home, went to Rock Canyon Elementary School for part of his 4th grade year, the second half of his 5th grade year, came back for his 8th grade year to Centennial Middle School, and then the latter half of his 11th grade year, when the family was evacuated from Cairo in 2011, did his last part of his junior year and then his senior year here in the United States. And that is not unusual, and probably about all Foreign Service officers through their careers are going to have to do unaccompanied posts. Particularly the last 8 years of my career, serving 5 years in Yemen and then 3 years in Iraq, was unaccompanied. Families are not allowed to go to posts like Yemen or Iraq, so you go without your family. So there are challenges in raising a family. There are challenges in maintaining sort of work-life balance, because when you're overseas, particularly in the more senior positions in embassies, you're 24/7. There's really not any sense that you have a life away from your work responsibilities. And the other part of it, particularly when you rise to the level of an ambassador, everybody is watching what you do all the time, whether it's the employees of the embassy or the host government, and everything you do is being scrutinized and judged and assessed. So you don't get much private life. My security detail in Iraq consisted of 140 contract personnel, former special forces operators and others, 3 shifts, 40 people on each shift. And so there was always somebody within a few yards of me, even in my home or residence, and any time I moved or did anywhere, it's quite an undertaking and an endeavor. So not a particularly quality of life conducive to sitting back and chilling. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you particularly for those of you who are part of the civic engagement. I encourage you to look at that, and I can stay afterwards for any who want to ask any other questions. So class dismissed. Is that right?